This is Canary Cry Radio.
Hey everybody, welcome to Canary Cry Radio. My name is Gons. Basil is in his slumber. He might join us at some point. It is episode number 116, and here with us today, this man requires no true introduction. He's a past guest, and he's the host of Skywatch TV, A View from the Bunker, PID Radio, and now he's an official, well, he has actually been an author of fictional books, but I think this is his first nonfiction book.
Correct.
Derek Gilbert, welcome back to Canary Cry Radio. How you doing?
Thanks, Gons. Thanks, Basil. Maybe
we'll see if that wakes him up.
Just awfully nice, that he even bothered to wake up for this interview. That shows where I rank in the list of guests. Really appreciate it.
Jeez. That's going to get back to him, and that'll straighten him up. So thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so we're just going to start talking here because you are about to publish a book, The Great Inception. Mm-hmm. This is, I believe this is sort of your conglomerate of what you've been looking at with this entire genre for years now. You're one of the first ones to start a podcast with PID Radio on the subject with your wife, Sharon. Is this really kind of the summation of everything you've seen and learned about the Bible and the stuff that doesn't get talked about?
Well, I don't know if I'd characterize it quite that way. I mean, really, this grew out of sheer desperation about a year ago because we at Skywatch TV were co-sponsoring the Rocky Mountain International Prophecy Conference last July in Colorado Springs. And Bob Ulrich, for reasons known only to him, chose to make me the final speaker in the main room on Sunday. So it's like, okay, we're going to have you bat cleanup. You're going to give the last presentation of the weekend in the main room.
Closer.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, now I've been, for the last few years, talking about two main topics. One is dominionism, dominion theology, or kingdom now theology. And I do touch on that in The Great Inception a bit. The other topic is transhumanism. And those are two things that Sharon and I have been researching, and we had started writing a book called Rise of the Cyber Gods. That got put on a shelf. Right. That will probably come back at some point. But I wanted to do something different than what I had been doing for the previous 3 or 4 years, just recycling the same material. I didn't feel that was fair to people who were paying either to travel to Colorado Springs or to watch the live stream on via the internet. So we've been doing an online Bible study each week, and this has sort of taken the place of PID Radio as far as our weekly schedule for me and Sharon. Sundays, we spend an hour on the Old Testament and an hour on the New Testament, and we're going through the Testaments in chronological order. And we had gotten to the book of Exodus and a story that we're all familiar with, which is the crossing of the Red Sea. And usually when I've heard this preached on in church, and what I remember of it in Sunday school, it's given to us as an object lesson in faith. Moses had faith that God would save them from the Egyptians. Okay, yeah, that's makes sense. That's logical. But when you read Exodus chapter 14, beginning at the first verse, you read that God told Moses to tell the Israelites to turn back, turn around. Okay, this is after the plagues, the slaying of the firstborn. The Israelites are leaving. Pharaoh has a change of heart, and he starts chasing them with his army and his chariots.
Right.
God tells the Israelites to turn around. I'd never noticed that before. So why did God tell them to turn around? And then the next verse, it says, okay, you're going to camp all night at a place next to Pi Hahiroth facing Baal Zephon. Wait a minute now. I'm no historian, but I know enough of ancient history to know that Baal was a Canaanite or Semitic god. He was not one of the Egyptian gods. What was Baal doing in Egypt? Why did God tell okay, well, if it's in the Bible, and this is something that Mike Heiser always says, and credit where it's due, by the way, just about everything you read in The Great Inception is based on the research of Mike Heiser and the Divine Counsel Paradigm, and his book, The Unseen Realm, especially. And if people haven't read that book, they should buy it right now. Stop the podcast, buy that book, and then read it.
Yeah, I agree. It's an audio book too, so no excuses.
Yeah, exactly. So I started doing some research to figure out why God would tell the Israelites to turn around. Why not send more flaming hailstones to destroy the Egyptian army? Why did he have them turn around, camp all night, facing a place called Baal Zephon before parting the Red Sea? Why make this big production out of it? Why stop all night and have the camp there all night with the column of smoke and fire between the Israelites and the Egyptian army?
Right.
Well, all right. Baal is a Canaanite deity. And what is Baal Zephon? What is Zephon? Turns out that's the name of the mountain in Turkey. It's on the border between Turkey and Syria, right on the Mediterranean coast, where everybody in the ancient world knew Baal's palace was located. That was Baal's holy mountain. All right, just like Yahweh has a holy mountain, and he's had actually several. If you read the Bible carefully, Eden was the first one, Sinai was the second. But Zephon was the holy mountain of Baal, or as they knew him back in the day, Hadad, the Semitic storm god. We in the Bible would know him as Baal. So that didn't answer the question of what was Baal doing in Egypt. Well, there's a period in Egyptian history called the Second Intermediate Period, where the Egyptians were not in control of northern Egypt. They were during the period of time that the Israelites were in Egypt, and for some period thereafter, the gods of Egypt had no sway in northern Egypt, or lower Egypt as it's called. The Semitic people called the Hyksos came down from Canaan and gradually took control of the Nile Delta. That's exactly where the Israelites were. And of course, scholars will say, well, there's no evidence of Israelite occupation in Egypt at any point ever. Well, that's just wrong. Scholars have known for decades, probably a century, that Semitic-speaking people called the Hyksos were in control of Egypt during the period of history when the Israelites would have been there. In fact, one of their kings was named Jacob. Yeah, Jacob Har, Jacob of the mountain. Now, probably not the patriarch Jacob, but it just makes the point that there were Semitic-speaking people in control of. And of course, when they came, they brought their gods, not just Baal, but Astarte, which was their version of Ishtar or Inanna, Venus, Aphrodite, same goddess, and another god called Resheph, who is interesting in his own right. We'll get to that later. And not only did they bring the worship of these Canaanite or Semitic gods into Egypt, after the Hyksos were run out of Egypt by the native Egyptian kings, King Ahmose was the one who finally did the deed, but they continued worshiping Baal for a couple hundred more years. In fact, about 200 years later, the great Pharaoh Ramses, or Yul Brynner, if you're old enough to remember the movie, was still a Baal worshiper. He erected a commemorative stela called the Year 400 stela that commemorated the arrival of Baal, who they equated with the Egyptian god Set, the brother of Osiris, the god of the desert, the god of chaos, the god of storms. During this period of Egyptian history, Baal and Set were the same. All right? So, just at the time, we'll step back and look at the overview. Just at the time that Jacob follows Joseph into Egypt, a Semitic people, basically the neighbors of the Israelites, Jacob and his family, had come down into Egypt at the same time and taken control of the political machinery there and brought their gods with them. So just as the Israelites were arriving in Egypt, Baal was arriving in Egypt. Now, is this a coincidence? I'm not much of a coincidence theorist.
Right.
Was it a coincidence that when the Israelites were being led out of Egypt by Yahweh, that Yahweh specifically told Moses, turn around, camp in front of this place named for the holy mountain of Baal.
Right.
Camp facing it all night. And then the next day, I'm going to do a miracle. Now, why the parting of the Red Sea? Hadad, Baal, was a storm god, but he was also in Canaanite cosmology, the god who mastered the god of the sea.
Right.
He was the god of chaos, Yam. And Yam's evil sidekick, Lotan, the sea monster, which is their version of Leviathan.
Right.
Okay. This is what we call a psychological operation, PSYOP, feeding false information to people in order to get them to change what they believe, because what you do depends on what you believe.
Right.
So Baal was the master of the sea. He was patron god of sailors for the Canaanites and the Phoenicians who followed them. And so God, Yahweh, has him camp all night in front of a place named for Baal's holy mountain, sacred to Baal, on the shore of the Red Sea. And then the next day, it's like, okay, you Baal worshipers, watch this. You want to say your God is the master of the sea? Boom, parts the Red Sea. A couple million Israelites go into this gap with a wall of water on either side. Now, the Egyptians, or the Hyksos, whichever, must have thought, okay, this is beautiful, because our God has obviously set a trap for these people. Because our God is the God of the sea, the master of the sea.
Right. They think Baal is doing the parting.
Exactly. They rush into the sea and then, boom, covered over, everybody dies. This was not a coincidence. This was not an accident. This was not Yahweh just showing off. This was Yahweh sending a very specific message to the spirit realm and to the fallen gods, fallen angels if you prefer, but God in the Bible calls them gods, so right. I'm on safe ground here, that they have no power except what God, Yahweh, allows them to have.
Right.
This was a specific message to all worshipers of these fallen gods, these rebellious gods, that Yahweh is supreme. This was God not just delivering them from the hand of Pharaoh, this was God delivering them from the hand of Baal. It was a very specific message. And the whole point of the book, The Great Inception, is that the Bible is filled with stuff like that if we read it with an eye to this, with a mindset that we're looking for these divine counsel references, that these gods, these rebellious gods, are real.
Right.
And that the Bible is a history of their rebellion and God's strategy, his plan, and his tactics for restoring humanity to our original place in the divine council on God's holy mountain.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable when you start looking into it. I mean, the whole time you're describing this whole part of the Exodus that's not often spoken about, or the context of it, it reminded me of the 1 Kings 18, right, with Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And it's kind of like one of those things, how did they not learn that, Baal isn't really maybe not the one that you should be worshiping if they killed all the people back in Egypt. But here we are in 1 Kings, with Elijah, the prophets of Baal, and the fire coming down. It's the same kind of thing, right? Same.
About 500 years later, yeah. But, that's a long period of time. I mean, let's think about, 500 years ago from us was, King Henry VIII?
Right.
So, that's a long period of time. And people have short memories.
True.
Very true. The Israelites had a long history of doing exactly that. I mean, Ahab was probably the worst of the bunch, because after the confrontation in Mount Carmel, and there's a kicker that I'll talk about here in just a second, because I almost forgot to include Mount Carmel in the book. I didn't include it in my presentation last summer, and then Sharon kind of nudged me afterwards and said, you missed one. You had 7 holy mountains in your presentation, but you missed a really big one. Like, really? And then when I started reading into it, it's like, oh yeah. But Ahab had that miracle happen right in front of him. But then when you read 1 Kings 19, 20, 21, 22, you discover that there were a couple of miraculous victories that God granted the army of Israel, the northern kingdom, against the Syrians, the Arameans. Overwhelming odds. And yet prophets came and said, look, Yahweh says, so that you will know that he is Lord. He's going to give the Arameans into your hand today. Even though the Bible describes the Israelite army looking like a flock of lost sheep, surrounded by a multitude.
Right.
So even though he had these 3 miracles happen, 2 major victories over the Aramean army that shouldn't have happened, plus the lightning from heaven on Mount Carmel, Ahab still continued worshiping Baal, and letting King Ben-Hadad of Aram, of Damascus, go after God had declared him Karem, devoted to destruction. And that caused the end of Ahab and his family line. Ahab, Mount Carmel is really remarkable when you think about it. Mount Carmel is another holy mountain. It was considered sacred at least as far back as the 15th century BC. 14th century BC. Thutmose III, who was like the greatest military commander, king that Egypt had until the time of Ramses the Great, fought as far north as the Euphrates in northern Syria, on his way to a battle at Megiddo against a coalition of Canaanite kings called Mount Carmel the Holy Headland. So we know that it was considered holy for a long time. We read in 1 Kings 18 that there was an altar to Yahweh that had been torn down to build one to Baal.
Right.
And of course, Jezebel was responsible for not just making the worship of Baal acceptable in Israel. And again, when I say Israel at this point, it was the northern kingdom. Judah was a separate kingdom by this point. Her father was a man named Eth-Baal, which means man of Baal, king of Tyre. He was a priest to the goddess Astarte, Ishtar, the goddess of sex and war. And by sex, we're not talking Venus and the image we have today of Venus as the goddess of love. No, we're talking carnal, extramarital, gender fluid sex.
Right. Which has been a part of the alchemical tradition for as long as there's been the tradition. It all seems to tie in together with a lot of the occult beliefs. I mean, this is where it comes from. These are the gods that gave the information in whatever means, channeling, whatever. So, it's really interesting. But I do want to ask you a question about specifically and talking about that holy mountain of God, Eden being the first one, and the guardian cherub being there at one point, Ezekiel 28. Who is the guardian cherub in the context of these other gods like Baal and Ashtaroth, Molech, Dagon, all these gods that exist in the ancient pantheon?
Well, that's a good question, and I don't think we can say for certain. We get hints in the Bible that it's Satan, but in the Old Testament, Satan is not a personal name; it's a title, Ha-Satan, the Satan, the accuser. It's a job description or a job title, and it's not until the Book of Revelation that you get a link between Satan and that old serpent,
right?
The dragon, and that kind of links back to the imagery of the serpent in the garden. But the serpent in Hebrew is the nakash, and elsewhere in the Old Testament, nakash is used interchangeably with seraph, which is the root word for seraphim.
Right.
So are we looking at a cherub? Are we looking at a seraph? One of the seraphim, one of the cherubim? I don't know. To be honest with you, I kind of look at that in some depth in the book. It's possible that this divine rebel in Eden was, one of more than one, rebel in Eden. I mean, maybe there was one of the seraphim and one of the cherubim. Both rebelled at the same time. The nakash, one of the seraphim, and a guardian cherub,
right,
who guarded the way to the tree of life, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Both rebelled. We don't know. Mike Heiser suggests that cherubim and seraphim may be different words for the same type of entity. They were typically, and they seem to fulfill the same role in the Bible and in ancient Near Eastern cosmology as sort of divine throne guardians, whether they're cherubim or seraphim. I mean, in the book of Isaiah, they're clearly guardians of the throne of Yahweh. The ancient kings, the kings of the ancient Near East, always had thrones that were surrounded by imagery of these cherubs, these that look more like sphinxes than the images that we have of cherubim. I think our image of what a cherub is been too heavily influenced by medieval painters.
Right? The little
chubby
babies.
little boys with dinky wings, flying around. No, this is absolutely incorrect. Cherubim were seriously bad dudes that you did not want to mess with.
Right.
They look more like a sphinx, like a winged lion or a winged bull than a human. But they had four different faces. The human, the ox, the eagle, and the lion. So it's imagery that was appropriated by human kings from the divine guardians in heaven. And again, this is part of that psyop that the enemy has been working against us since the beginning. Ye shall be as gods. Well, you're a king. You deserve the same type of guardian that that the gods have. So
right.
And in different cultures, they're called different things, Lamassu or Shedu, but it's hard to say. Again, Nakash, Seraph, interchangeable in the Old Testament. So we get this idea of and plus, as Dr. Heiser's done a really excellent job of breaking down the implications and meanings of the word Nakash, without getting into all of the etymology, because I'm not an ancient language scholar. Essentially, it implies something that is a glowing or like illuminating,
shining bronze.
That shining was the word I was trying to think of. Shining being of a divine appearance and possibly serpentine appearance, because Nakash also often translated as snake or serpent. So, which raises other questions about some of the imagery and little figurines that have been found in the ancient Near East. But so you got this shining serpentine entity in the garden speaking to Adam and Eve. But then you got this image of the cherub looking like a really, frightening winged bull or lion. Which is the correct image? I don't know the answer to that.
Right.
Again, we've got a couple different answers, either different names for the same entity, or you've got multiple entities, more than one, who decided to rebel. And considering that you've got the incident on Mount Hermon with the Watchers, possibly as many as 200 rebel angels who decided to rebel then. And then you've got the 70 sons of God, B'nai Elohim, who rebelled after the Tower of Babel,
right,
when God placed them over the nation. So you've got multiple waves of rebellion against God the Father, God the Creator, to deal with. And the Bible, again, reflects that if we know what to look for. It's a lot more exciting when you're reading this and understanding that a lot of things that are happening there are concealed because of the limits of English as a language, and because of choices that translators have made.
Right.
To kind of de-emphasize the supernatural aspect of these confrontations.
Yeah, I remember David Flynn in his groundbreaking book, the Sidonia Chronicles of Mars, talking about some of the stuff you mentioned here with the form of a cherubim or cherubim, what they look like. I know he makes the connection to those faces on Mars and whatnot. Mm-hmm. That's it's still debatable kind of stuff, but he brought up the connection to the holy mountain idea in certain in other mythologies. I think Greek mythology, right? The story of Arthur when heaven and earth touched, that mm-hmm. sort of thing. Yeah. So it's really interesting that there is this mountain idea. It almost makes me think that in my head, in my crazy imagination, as I was going over some of the stuff you've written, just seeing literally the sky or some. I don't know how to really describe it, but some sort of twister opening up in the sky, and here's God coming down during Ezekiel's vision, during Elijah being taken away by the whirlwind. All these events seem to suggest some sort of dimensional thing going on. I mean, that's the best way we can describe it in our sort of modern vernacular with science fiction and all that. Yeah. It just seems to make sense. And that's that supernatural context that is completely removed from the biblical story as far as people get it today. And I think, it's just important to get this stuff because it makes the Bible much more exciting, I think.
Well, even more than that, I think from the importance, I think it's important as a soldier in a supernatural war, which we all are. I mean, whether we acknowledge the fact or not, we are on a battlefield surrounded by enemy combatants who want to kill us and everyone that we love. So why wouldn't you want to know everything you could possibly know about these entities who are far older, far more intelligent, and want to do you harm?
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that just seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah, and it seems like that same war is manifesting so much in today's kind of chaotic landscape of where we're at with everything. And I know you didn't specifically probably bring up transhumanism in this book, but I do want to touch on some of that a little bit because obviously you've been looking at it, and I think you also see the prophetic implications of some of that stuff and tying it back to the ancient past with these gods. What do you think is going to be the connection or I guess, is there a narrative that could be spun with, the whole disclosure thing? I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities, a lot of conspiracy fringe topics to get into, but.
Well, I sure hope so, because we're probably going to be writing a book on that by the end of the year. So
okay, great.
Well, yeah, hope so. You're correct, and I think there's a parallel to be drawn with the Watchers, and this is something that Mike gets into in his new book, Reversing Herman, which is being released at the same time as and by the same publisher, Defender Publishing, which is Tom Horn, his publishing company, being released at the same time as my book, and. Just let me throw in a plug here. If you purchase the two books together from the Skywatch TV store, which is at skywatchtvstore.com, you not only get a decent price, a discount on the two books combined, but then you also get a hardcover edition of the Book of First Enoch, which is what most people refer to when they call it the Book of Enoch. It's the Book of First Enoch. And then a DVD with like 5 hours of me talking about the material from the book, and a CD with 7 hours of audio interviews with me, interviewing Mike over the years, everything from ufology to his novels, the Facade and the Portent, and his books, The Unseen Realm, and the new one, Reversing Herman. All of that, for less than what it would cost to buy the two books at full list price. So. You get that at the Skywatch TV store. But Mike on Reversing Herman points out that in the first century, actually the whole Second Temple period, which is the period from between the return of the Jews from Babylon and the destruction of the temple by the Romans in AD 70. Jews, a literate Jew during that period, if you asked them why the world was in such a lousy condition, why evil was rampant and people were mean to each other, you'd get a different answer than if you asked that question of a 21st century American Christian.
Right.
I mean, you ask one of us and we'll say, well, it's because of the fall in the garden, Genesis 3. We disobeyed, and that brought sin and death into the world, and that's why everything is terrible. If you ask a first century Jew, like one of the apostles, you'd get a different answer. They'd say, well, yeah, that was important, but what really took, when things really went off the rails was when the Watchers came down at Mount Hermon and brought all of this. I mean, yeah, the Nephilim, that was bad, but they also brought all of this knowledge we weren't supposed to have, like how to make implements of war, how to practice witchcraft and sorcery, and
right.
Cosmetics, and not that cosmetics are a bad thing, but in the sense of deception, things that we weren't supposed to know, astrology, necromancy, things like contacting the spirit realm. These were things that humanity was not supposed to know, and the Watchers, according to the extra biblical Book of Enoch and other literature lumped together under the term Enochian literature. This was part of the Jewish understanding of the way the world worked in the first century, the time of Jesus. They understood this, and Mike's book shows how that understanding has influenced New Testament theology. And since the apostles wrote the New Testament under the influence of the Holy Spirit, perhaps we should take it seriously.
Right.
So now, that being the case, sometime back in, 5,000 BC or whenever we can guess, and we have to guess because we don't know for sure when the Watchers came down and muddied the waters by teaching humans who were greedy for secret knowledge, things that we weren't supposed to know. We can see, I think, a parallel to what is taking place in laboratories around the world today, where now scientists are openly admitting, oh, yeah, we're creating human-animal chimeras. Oh, yeah, we're openly working on super-fast brain-computer interfaces so that we can merge our own biology with technology and enhance our ability to think by billions, perhaps trillions of times. We are trying to find ways to radically extend human life to the point that we essentially live forever. In other words, what we're trying to do is to fulfill the promise made by the Nakash in the garden through technology. Ye shall be as gods. And I think there's a very strong parallel between that and what the Watchers did in Genesis 6. Although it's not specific in Genesis 6, it's implied. You have to read, again, Second Temple Jewish literature to get the specifics.
Yeah, and one of the words used in the Book of Enoch is that these watchers defiled themselves and reveled to them these sins with those women who have defiled themselves. And so, man, to me, it's there's an element of the gospel with the virgin birth of Christ that resonates in this sort of unholy union that took place with the watchers and that whole narrative of Genesis 6. And kind of the question is, were these watchers, were they just spirits that became flesh? Did they possess humans? Did they, like, what was the method? I think that a lot of people, I mean, obviously, ultimately it doesn't matter a whole lot, but people question that, you know, and I always point out that, because people say, well, look at Luke and look at Jesus's words saying that, you know, angels don't marry in heaven. Well, yeah, that's in heaven. The whole point is that they left their abode and came down. So what does that look like in your research in terms of the actual sort of the mechanisms of what that looked like?
Well, it has to be somewhat speculative because we don't know for sure.
Sure. But, and I ask this question only because I think, as we're talking about here, they're trying to do something very similar now. And so that's why I bring it up.
Well, when we look at the Bible and we see that angels are encountered by various characters, Joshua, Abraham, Gideon, have specific encounters with angels, and they clearly have physical form. I mean, specifically Abraham with 3 angels, the 2 that go on to rescue Lot from Sodom. And of course, the angel of the Lord, which is a Christophany, Yahweh, but not Yahweh, the second power in heaven.
Right.
But they eat a meal.
Right.
They eat a meal with Abraham. So they clearly have physicality. I would suggest that angels, and that's again another English term that has very limited.
Sure. I know when we say angels, it means something completely different from the from common culture out there today.
Yeah. It is a term that encompasses a broad range of entities: cherubim, seraphim, malachim, ophanim, and perhaps some others even. But demons, who were the spirits, and again, this is per extra biblical literature, Second Temple literature, were the spirits of the giants who died during the flood, the spirits of the Nephilim. So demons do not have physicality; they need to inhabit a body, whereas angels do not. They have physicality.
Right.
They are probably interdimensional. They can manifest in our 4-dimensional space, but then move out of it again. Whereas demons, again, in order to interact with the environment, they need to inhabit a human or some other entity, some other creature.
I think
I've known some cats. I'm pretty sure were possessed.
Well, I think you're right, and you go over the origin of demons in your book, and you cover, not just the Enochian view or the Book of Enoch view of the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, but also I believe there was a Greek author that sort of confirmed the same thing, but they had a flipped view, a favorable view of these disembodied spirits.
Right. Hesiod, who has written a couple of things, Theogony and Works and Days. And we know a lot of what we know about Greek mythology comes from Hesiod.
Right.
To the Greeks, the daimons, Daimones, were considered more favorably than demons to the Mesopotamians or to the Jews. They were believed to be the spirits of the men who lived during the golden age of Kronos, and that when they died, they became these daimons who traveled about the earth and blessed humanity. So there was at least an agreement, and I would argue this is another psyop by the enemy, by the fallen, to convince us that, or to convince our ancestors a couple thousand years ago that these spirits are really good. You really ought to get yourself one. Be inhabited, be special. And Russ Dizdar says that even today, though, there are people who are afflicted by demons who don't want to become dispossessed, depossessed, unpossessed, because then they lose these powers that they're getting from hosting a demonic spirit.
Right.
Which to us sounds insane, but I guess from a certain perspective, it makes some kind of sense.
But you look at entertainment media, you look at how they portray themselves in quote unquote art. And I think anybody who looks at it would say, yeah, they're not representing probably the most wholesome of ideas. But
the thing that amazed me in researching the book was, again, scholars, secular scholars have known a lot of the stuff that's in this book for a long, long time. And for some reason, it's just never made it into the church. Hesiod, the Greek writer who wrote about the 6th century BC, about the time of Nebuchadnezzar and Isaiah and Ezekiel, and that general time frame, was writing a lot of stuff that later writers, Christian writers, said, well, yeah, this is kind of what happened, but not exactly.
Right.
It was a psyop in the sense that the information is sort of true, but not really. And it was intended by the enemy, the principalities, powers, thrones, dominions that the Apostle Paul warned us about, to throw humanity off track, to understand incorrectly what these things were and the threat that they posed to us. Thing that really blew my mind in researching a particular question that had kind of nagged at me once I started down this trail, and it kind of comes back to Hesiod, because his work is kind of key in pulling out this thread. And if you don't mind me going down a rabbit trail
here, for it,
because this takes a little while to.
No,
this is one of the things that I go into the book, which I think is something that is mind blowing. In a nutshell, there is a lot more. There's a lot more correlation between Greek and Roman mythology and what we read in the Bible than we've ever been taught. I mean, I think most of us who had to take mythology classes in high school come away thinking, oh, it's nice fiction. These are like Aesop's fables, No, to the ancient Greeks and Romans, this was their religion, and they took it every bit as seriously, if not more so, than most American Christians do today. This was what they based their view of the world on. They were serious about following and worshiping their gods, every bit as much as the Jews were about Yahweh. The question that I started that led me down this path was wondering, when God made his covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, he tells Abraham, your descendants are going to go to a land that's not theirs. They're going to be there for 4 generations, and they'll come back after the 4th generation because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete.
Right.
All right. So who are the Amorites? Well, most of us who have only heard of the Amorites by reading the Bible or hearing them mentioned once in a while in church, okay, that's just one of the groups, one of the people groups that the Israelites had to push out of the way when they were, when they came to take possession of Canaan, the Holy Land. And they had those 2 really big Amorite kings on the east side of the Jordan River, Sihon of Heshbon and Og of Bashan. But other than that, we really don't know anything about the Amorites, most of us. Neither did I, until I started reading about a year ago and found that there's like a whole subculture in archaeological studies of people who just study the Amorites.
Huh.
What's the deal with the Amorites? Why were they important? Why did God tie the return of Israel from Egypt to Canaan?
Right.
To the sin, the iniquity of the Amorites? Well, lo and behold, from about 2000 BC, which is just about the time that God was calling Abram, later Abraham, out of Ur, and I make the case in the book that it's not Ur, but actually a city called Urah in what is now Turkey. He didn't come from what is now Iraq in southeast Mesopotamia. He came from northern Mesopotamia.
Right.
But anyway, about the time God was calling Abraham, the Amorites were moving from their origin, places of origin in oddly enough, the places in Syria today that are pretty much the heartland of Islamic State territory. Again, just another coincidence?
Yeah, I don't know.
Anyway, the Amorites basically took over all of the ancient Near East. They, for about 400 years, from 2000 BC until about 1600 BC, which was the time of the sojourn in Egypt and just before the Exodus, which took place around 1450 BC, The Amorites were in control of everything in the ancient Near East. Canaan, all of Syria, all of what is today Iraq, southern Turkey. The Amorites somehow wound up in control of everything. And here's the key thing. The Amorites founded Babylon. There is no ethnicity called Babylonian. Right? That's like calling me Chicagoan or, Chicagoite because I was born there. When the truth is I'm German, Swedish, English, Welsh, etc.
Right.
Babylon was an unimportant, nothing little village until about 1800 BC, when an Amorite king named Sumu Abam became king. And in fact, it was like 4 generations later before any of those kings in that Babylonian dynasty that included Hammurabi the Great even bothered to call themselves king of Babylon. Huh. So, with all due respect to Bible teachers who for a century and a half have been putting the Tower of Babel in Babylon, it's time we stop teaching that because it's wrong. Nimrod lived about 1,200 years before Babylon was even a city.
Right. I saw you point that out, and it had never even occurred to me that was even because you just, because of the linguistic similarities with Babel and Babylon, you just assume that, oh yeah, Babel in Babylon, but no, you look at it and that's not the case. Exactly.
And that's why scholars keep putting Abraham in Ur of Sumer, which is southeast Iraq, instead of Ura, which is northern Syria, southern Turkey, which is where Haran is located, named for his brother, or his brother named for the city, actually. Anyway, so the Amorites were the ones who founded Babylon and founded the occult system, on which has become really a byword for occult wickedness, spiritual wickedness, prophetic spiritual wickedness, because the final, the one world religion of the end times is Mystery Babylon.
Right.
That's on the Amorites. Okay. That is part of the iniquity of the Amorites. All right. Things begin to make a little more sense. But here's the thing that really blew my mind when I was digging into this. So the Amorites had control of that whole area. By the way, I had to wonder when I was doing this research, that was about the same period of time that the Hyksos, these Semitic-speaking, like the Amorites, Semitic-speaking people were in control of northern Egypt. I wonder if they were Amorite too. Yeah, sure enough. Scholars have known this for a long time. Hyksos were actually Amorites. Their most famous king had a name that shows up in the ancient king lists of some of the Amorite royal dynasties of Mesopotamia. So... But here's another name that shows up in the royal dynasties of the Amorites, of the old Babylonian kingdom, the old Assyrian kingdom, and the Ugaritic kingdom. Now, Ugarit was a city-state, Syrian coast. The peak of its power was about the time of the Judges in the Old Testament, 14th to 12th century BC. That royal dynasty also traced their family line back to an ancestor named Dedan, as in Dedan and Sheba. Shows up in Ezekiel 38, shows up in Genesis 10, Table of Nations.
Right.
They happen to be nephews of Nimrod, which I don't think is a coincidence. But there was a tribe that apparently was named for this ancestor, Dedan, called the Dedanu, or the Tidanu. It depended on, who was writing it down, a Babylonian, Akkadian scribe, whichever. But all of the royal houses of the Amorites, at least the ones that we can really trace, there was a very powerful Amorite kingdom in northern Syria centered on the city of Aleppo. And we really don't know much about them because Aleppo has never been depopulated. So there's a lot of stuff buried underneath the city that we haven't dug up yet, or archaeologists haven't dug up yet. But anyway, the Ugaritic kings, the old Assyrian kings, the old Babylonian kings, all trace their ancestry back to this ancestor, Dedan, and this tribe of Ditanu or Tidanu, who had kind of a military reputation.
Right.
And in fact, they were considered such fearsome warriors that the last Sumerian kings of Mesopotamia, who ruled from the city of Ur around 2100 BC to 2000 BC, they actually built a wall 175 miles long that stretched from the Euphrates River across the Tigris River and then around to another river called the Diyala, which runs northeast out of Baghdad.
Wow.
And they actually named this wall the Amorite Wall that keeps the Tadanu away. I mean, you couldn't get more plain than that. And in fact, there's a lament for the destruction of some of the cities of ancient Mesopotamia that blame the Tadanu, who, always strap on the sword, or some such. So the point being, they were considered really fearsome warriors and were enough of a problem that the ancient Sumerians built this massive wall to try to keep them off their lands and away from their cities.
Right.
Now, about 35 years ago, a tablet from Ugarit was translated by scholars, and it was a coronation ritual for the last king of Ugarit, whose name was Hammurabi III. Hammurabi, it's the same name, by the way, as Hammurabi, who lived about 300 years before, or 500 years before Hammurabi. And in this ritual, they actually summon spirits of the dead. And they specifically summon the spirits of the Rephaim. Okay? But they also summon spirits from something they called the Council of the Ditanu. All right? So file a mental bookmark there, because this is the same name as this tribe that hundreds of years earlier, like 700 years earlier, caused the kings of the last Sumerian king. There were no more Sumerian kings after they got wiped out. And that was the Amorites took over, the Sumerian kings, done. Assimilated into the population, Sumer destroyed, never to rise again. And that's why it became Babylonia instead of Sumer after that. Now, a scholar by the name of Amar Anus, who has written a number of really important academic papers, Heiser, Mike references a couple of them in the Unseen Realm, one dealing with the Watchers and the Mesopotamian Apkallu.
Right.
Yeah, the Apkallu were what the Mesopotamians called the Watchers.
Yeah.
Well, he wrote another paper about 17 years ago, 1999, 2000, speculating on the possible existence of Greek Rephaim.
Ooh.
So I started reading this because I thought, oh, this is interesting. This might be. And I stumbled onto this in this paper. Trying to make a long story short, he says that the root word of Rephaim is RPI in the Semitic, the Canaanite. He said that is a phrase that Hesiod, back to the Greek writer Hesiod, used in his work Theogony as part of a root word called meropes anthropoi. And he said it's difficult to translate that phrase, but essentially that's a phrase that means men of the golden age.
Wow.
Okay. Men of the golden age who lived when Kronos was king. Now, that was the time when the Titans ruled the land. All right. Now, the Titans, you remember your Greek mythology, were deposed by the Olympians, led by Zeus.
Right.
Kronos was a really bad father. He had been told that his kids would overthrow him someday, and so he ate them as soon as they were born. Right. Yeah, except that his wife Rhea fooled him by giving him a rock instead of Zeus. Now, a good thing Cronus is not a picky eater. As he swallowed the rock, Zeus grew up and managed to overthrow Cronus and the other Titans and banished them to Tartarus. And Tartarus is not Hades. Tartarus, according to Greek mythology, Greek cosmology, is as far below Hades as the earth is below heaven. It's like a special hell reserved for the angels who sinned.
Right.
Now, Tartarus, most people don't know, is mentioned in the New Testament.
Right.
2 Peter 2:4, he talks about the angels who sinned, who were thrust down to Tartarus. And the Greek verb used there is tatarao, the only place in the New Testament it's ever used. And there's only one place in the Bible where we know where angels sinned, and that's the Watchers in Genesis chapter 6.
Right.
Watchers equals Titans, thrust down to Tartarus. Okay? The men of the golden age that Hesiod wrote about, these meropes anthropoi, again, root word for meropes, the same root as Rephaim in Semitic.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's pretty crazy.
Nephilim equals Nephilim equals Rephaim. All right?
Right.
And he identifies in in one of his writings, he identifies some of these Merapes anthropoi, Theseus, the Greek hero Theseus. Names another one, Aegeus, the Aegean Sea named for him. He was a king who, committed suicide by jumping off a cliff into the sea. Polyphemus, who was the Cyclops in the story of Odysseus. Okay, those were the Nephilim, the men of the golden age of Kronos. Now, back to the kings of Ugarit and this summoning ceremony to crown the new king, where they summoned the spirits of the Rephaim, and at the council of the Ditanu. And here's the kicker. The council of the Ditanu, according to the scholar Amar Anus, the root word for the Greek word titanes, titans, is Ditanu. The council of the Titans is who is being summoned in this coronation ritual for this Amorite king of Ugarit.
Wow.
And there is evidence from Babylon that there was an ancestor veneration, if not worship, that took place there among the royal family there as well. Hammurabi the Great traced his ancestry back to one Ditanu. Some of the kings of Babylon, descendants of Hammurabi, were named. It had Ditanu as an element in the name. And here's another thing. It was common in that day and age, second millennium BC, for names to have what's called a theophoric element. It's a reference to a god. And we see that in the Bible, like Samuel, right, or Daniel, Hezekiah, you say that in the pagan cultures around there too. Now, most scholars who look at the name of Hammurabi or this last king of Ugarit, Amurabi, he didn't know it when he was being crowned with this ritual that the sea peoples, what the scholars call them, were about to destroy Ugarit and kill him. So, sadly, the Titans and the Rephaim didn't help him much. But his name, they say, is a compound name with a theophoric element. And the theophoric element is the Rapi, the RPI. But scholars will say that, RPI, well, it's also a root word that can mean healer, like, a doctor or physician. Right. Even though they admit there is no example that they can point to of any RPI, Rapha, or Raphayu, or Rephaim actually healing or serving in any capacity that looks like a healer. But they will say that the name means my kinsman, like Amu. It's like Ami in like the Ammonites, the son of Lot and his daughter through their illicit relationship was named Ben Ami, son of my kinsman. Mm-hmm. So Amurabi, Amurapi means my kinsman is a healer? I don't think so. I think it probably means, and I'm no scholar, so I could be way off base here, but scholars admit that this RPI root word from which we get Rephaim, we never see one of these things actually healing anything. I think it means my kinsmen are the Rephaim.
Right.
And that was what the Amorite kings of Ugarit, of Babylon, were apparently into. They appear to have believed that they were descendants of the Titans, or subject to the Titans and descendants of the Watchers, descendants of the Nephilim.
Right. And that's so bizarre you mentioned that, because, and tying it again to the modern sort of world of what we're looking at, and we'll bring in Basil here. It looks like he made it.
Hey,
I'm here ready to rock and roll, baby.
All right. But it's really interesting you say that, because a lot of what's coming out now is that the deep state, or the elite, or what we've labeled the Illuminati or whatever, they all believe that they are the descendants of these. And I'm not saying that they are. I think some of them, I think most of them, if you test their DNA and whatnot, they're human. I think they're probably deceived on that level. But as far as conjuring spirits and things like that, I mean, they're definitely doing that. They're definitely externalizing all that. So it's no surprise. But what I find so fascinating is that the more we uncover ancient mythologies and worldview, the context of everything, the more there is a very clear synthesis between a lot of these different cultures that, traditionally we've been conditioned to say, if you're a Christian and you talk about any other religion, they're wrong because you're a Christian, you believe in one God, they believe in a pantheon, so it's all lies, it's untrue. And the discussion seems to be much more nuanced than that, and it incorporates a lot of the truths that these other cultures and religions have, but you just have to look at the origin. Where does it really stem from? And that's where you start finding a very clear consensus with these watchers or spirit beings from the sky, however they describe it. So I find that whole thing fascinating because it verifies the Bible and verifies these other gods. Now the question is, what's the intent of them? Where does it all come from? What's the narrative? And that's when you can really, the line is clearly drawn in the sand, so to speak, because you can continue to partake in the Antichrist spirit that John talked about, and the Babylonian system, as you outlined, is not just, a people or just a group, but it's really a spirit that's behind it. And it's alive and well today, I would say. I think most of us would agree that that's the case. So it's just very fascinating that the more we learn about the past, the more we understand where we're at, and looking into some of the crazy things that the transhumanists and the futurists are saying they want to do. It doesn't sound far-fetched when you talk about, well, yeah, they believe that they're going to, they're conjuring Rephaim spirits, the spirits of the dead. Yeah, of course they want to manifest that and control it, and technology with the electromagnetism and all that. It seems to be the perfect vehicle for some of that, which, is perhaps why guys like Elon Musk is out there saying, "Oh, this AI is going to unleash the demon," and all this stuff.
But then on the other hand, he turns around and says, "But we need to merge with that with the technology, otherwise we're going to become irrelevant."
Right. So it's becoming a demon, but we have to merge with it to prevent the demon from manifesting. Basically, is his plan there?
Yeah, you guys are taking that out of context. That's not fair. Well, that's fascinating. I got to jump in at a very fun spot there. Sorry, I think I had a medical emergency, but I'm back in action. I got to agree with Gons. I kind of felt kind of the same about when it comes to Greek mythology, Roman mythology. We talk about a lot of that, especially when we start talking about the Illuminati. But to see how those things are all connected really explains a lot more of the influence of why we're still sort of dealing with a lot of that today when it comes to, certain occult systems or a secret society or something like that. And it just makes so much more sense now why they have endured for so many hundreds or thousands of years. And could possibly endure for another 100 or 1,000 years, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. So, it seems like an important thing to realize, and I mean that in the literal. Whoa!
Oh my gosh!
Is that you?
Sorry. Yeah.
Come on, I was on a roll.
I'm sorry. The computers have changed and things infiltrate each other. And
was your computer phone call?
That was my phone, but it rings on my computer now, and
I know.
It's all just one big. All just one big Borg now.
Welcome to Skynet, baby.
Yeah.
So it gives a lot more weight to when we talk about certain other connections with Greek mythology and other past belief systems.
It seems like the enemy, the psyop, as you say, this cosmic psyop. The enemy has diversified in different cultures and religions. And one of the examples just recently, I just published actually this morning, I've been working on it all week, a video outlining Beyonce's whole, Grammy thing. A lot of people made videos on that. I did as well, but I found a document, which is actually a whole research paper on Yoruba customs and beliefs. Yoruba being the religion, southwestern Nigerian religion of origin, which has a pantheon of gods and goddesses, of which one of them Beyonce channeled. That's what the Hollywood insiders and media people were saying. Beyonce channels Oshun, the goddess of a Yoruba. And so this isn't speculation. This is them saying it, even if they don't mean channeling in the same perhaps sense that we do. nevertheless, I think that's what she's doing, or that's what they're trying to do. And it's really interesting because, as most people know, Beyonce's pregnant with twins, and she's up there doing her thing. Well, this paper, Yoruba Customs and Beliefs Pertaining to Twins, was published by a twin research syndicate. And the paper goes through and talks about how the Yoruba population have the highest twinning rate in the world. And the fact that there is tons of rituals that have traditionally been associated with it. Traditionally, back when the earliest days of Yoruba, they used to sacrifice twins because they thought it was an evil, not a good thing that they had twins. But, obviously that changed. Now they're in favor. But even now, if the twins die, they believe that the twins itself come from preternatural origins. That's on the research paper saying, that's what they believe. And they, if they die, they will assign and create images, little statues, where they believe that the spirit of the deceased twins will inhabit, and they take care of the images. I mean, it sounds like Old Testament, like just straight up all the stuff that was happening there. And it's just amazing that, and again, you look at these statues and these masks and stuff, and they have all these rituals. And, on one hand, it's you have to appreciate the culture. You have to appreciate the human artistic ingenuity and creativity. But on the other hand, you start looking at the origins, and it all kind of goes back to the same place, which is, and in the paper, I brought this up. Sorry, I had kind of a long rant, but I brought it up because the authors of the paper say that the pantheon of the gods of Yoruba is a reflection of the Greek pantheon. And so as much to call it, I believe there was a specific term, the African pantheon of gods or something, some phrase that basically said this is the same thing, but just its African form. And you do that, and there you go. All the stuff we've been talking about with the connection to the Nephilim and the Titans and everything else and the Watchers, there you go. There it is again. So right there in front of the entire population, Beyonce doing her performance has a direct tie to the Nephilim and everything that's found in the Bible, specifically pertaining to Genesis 6. And most Christians are completely unaware of that. So,
well, exactly. And again, it's because we've been taught that there are no other gods, that they're just the product of fertile imaginations and fertile pagan imaginations. But when you read the Bible and you see that God specifically tells tells Moses, on the night that I'm going to come through Egypt and slay the firstborn of the Egyptians, I'm going to execute judgment on all of their gods. Okay, was God mistaken? Did he not know that these are just imaginary beings, just blocks of wood and stone? I mean, no, wow. Of course not. When you read and start studying the cosmologies of the ancient world, you see that what the Greeks and Romans believed was essentially handed to them, not handed to them, but was transmitted from east to west. Zeus, their chief god, the king of the gods, was the storm god. Well, his holy mountain, one of his holy mountains, besides Olympus, was Mount Casios. Guess what? Mount Casios is Mount Zaphon. It's Baal's holy mountain. Well, it makes sense because, like Baal, Zeus, like Baal, was a storm god. To the Hittites, he was Tarhunt. To the Hurrians, he was Teshub. To the ancient Sumerians, he was Ishkur. Same God, different name, different guys, different culture. The Anglo-Saxons called him Thor. Same deity. You can just trace him through history. There was another manifestation that was known to the ancient cultures of India. So the enemy doesn't care what we believe as long as it's not the one thing that's true. And they have a long history of kind of throwing sand in our eyes. We can't identify, this God from this culture is definitely specifically the same God as this one in this culture. We don't know that for a fact. We don't know for certain. All we can do is kind of look big picture and then just, pray to God, for discernment and wisdom. But there are patterns that repeat in these cultures. I mean, when you look at the Titanomachy, the war between the Olympians and the Titans, you get that same picture in the Canaanite culture with Baal, and there's some tension between Baal and the chief god El. You see it in the Hurrian culture. There's a struggle, a conflict between their storm god Teshub and the high god, or not the high god, but his predecessor named Kumarbi. And it's the same thing. You get like three different levels of gods in these cultures. The Greeks had Uranus, and then Kronos, and then Zeus, and in the Hurrian culture, which would have been northern Mesopotamia up to like the Armenia area, would have been Anu, the creator god, Kumarbi, the grain god, and then Teshub, the storm god. It basically, you can trace Greek and Roman mythology all the way back to ancient Sumer. And it goes through some changes, goes through some modification, but it's basically the same stuff.
That's fascinating. Now, one thing that I'm curious about is, like you said, these gods, kind of pop up in the Bible. God talks about taking them out. They obviously have connections with, all sorts of shady stuff that we talk about around here. Is there well, I think there is, but can you explain what the practical purpose of this sort of discovery can have in people's lives? It's nice to connect a lot of dots, but I feel like there might be some practical application to some of this.
Well, I think the key thing in understanding the long arc of history is understanding that we are part of a long game, a long war that has been waged between these rebellious gods and our creator God, that holy mountains have always played a key role, and that essentially the Bible is a chronicle of how we got kicked off of God's holy mountain, Eden, and out of the divine council. God's plan to restore us to that position in the divine council on his holy mountain, where his holy mountain is going to be in the future, and then some prophetic clues as to how the end game of history plays out. We know from the Bible that God's holy mountain is Zion. That would be the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. I make the point in the book, and this is something scholars have it's not original to me, but it's not often taught in church because, again, because of the similarity of the names, we confuse the Tower of Babel with the city of Babylon, even though there was more than a millennium between the two. We confuse Armageddon, which is the big battle between good and evil for all the marbles, with the Valley of Megiddo. And it's because of transliteration between Greek and Hebrew, and then back to Greek and then to English, basically, or something like that. What it comes down to in a nutshell is that instead of Har Megiddo, or the Mount of Megiddo, being the site of this final battle, it's Har Moed, the Mount of Assembly. And you find that phrase, the Mount of Assembly or Mount of the Congregation, over and over in the Bible, if you're looking for it, as the place where God meets with his divine council, Yahweh with his divine council, but also where the rebellious gods want to establish their headquarters, their home, as superior to that of God. You see that in Isaiah 14, where the divine rebel wants to establish his throne, his mount of assembly, in the sides of the north, which I should point out, the compass point north in Hebrew is the same as the name of Baal's holy mountain, Zaphon. That's how important Mount Zaphon, Baal's holy mountain, was in Jewish culture. They actually named the compass point north because that's where Baal's holy mountain was, which has some interesting implications for prophecy, by the way. Sides of the north is a phrase that pops up in Ezekiel 38, but setting that aside. So the practical application, understanding where humanity was, Adam and Eve in the garden, part of the divine council with God, lost that position because of their sin, their rebellion. All of history then being these rebel gods trying to keep us away from and out of the divine council and off of God's holy mountain. God signals to the fallen at Sinai that he's going to reconstitute the divine council with humanity. Gons, I know both of you guys are aware of this because I know you talked to Mike Heiser before. We know that there were 70 nations when God divided the nations after Babel.
Right.
The table of nations, Genesis chapter 10, there are 70 nations defined. Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 and 9 tells us that the number of nations was, God divided the nations according to the number of the sons of God.
Right.
70 B'nai Elohim. Mike has also shown us in Canaanite literature, their cosmology, they believed that there were 70 sons of El, which was their chief deity. And I stumbled onto scholarly research showing that the Canaanites actually believed that they thought that the holy mountain of El, his mountain of divine assembly, was Mount Hermon. So, which makes the transfiguration even more significant,
right?
Because that took place on Hermon. So anyway, so you've got these 70 rebel gods placed over the nations after the Tower of Babel. After Yahweh brings Israel out of Egypt by humiliating the chief god of northern Egypt at that time, Baal, master of the sea, watch this, Red Sea, foom, foom, okay?
Right.
He brings them to the mountain of God, Sinai. And after giving Moses the law, but before giving him the plans for the tabernacle, he does something remarkable. Yahweh says, okay, Moses, bring Aaron and his sons, the priests, and the 70 elders of Egypt, or not Egypt, I'm sorry, the 70 elders of Israel. And he brings them up onto Sinai. And the 70, which is not a coincidental number, the 70 elders of Israel, along with Moses, Aaron, and Aaron's sons, have a meal with Yahweh. Okay? Why is that significant? Because that's the first time since Eden that humans had been face to face with God on his holy mountain. Wow. This was a message to the rebel gods. I'm reconstituting the divine council. I'm bringing humans back into the council. Your days are numbered, and we're coming for you.
Mic drop.
Exactly. If there was a microphone in heaven, it's that point, boom. That's
wow, that's amazing.
Well, just to add to that and to kind of, because I think, Basil, I think your question was sort of something that most people who don't look into this stuff have, right? That question of like, okay, well, I know this stuff. Why does it matter? And I think for most Christians, it's like just the knowledge of it changes the understanding of the gospel in a way it doesn't change the gospel. It just changes, your full understanding of the word of God, which I don't think is a bad thing for any Christian.
No.
But then it shapes, as you said, Derek, it shapes kind of the understanding of the greater cosmic timeline, the history of humanity, where we are as part of it, and what the ultimate destination, what God's goals are, what God's war has been with the rebellious ones for ever since the beginning,
Right.
It just gives it a better context to everything in life, I think.
Exactly. And then prophetically, that's why the final battle is not going to be fought at Megiddo, because, Megiddo, I'm sorry, there's no mountain at Megiddo. It's a valley.
Right.
Okay. Har Moed, Mount of Assembly, the Mount of the Congregation. We know from the Bible that, that is where God has established his name. His throne is on Zion. That is his holy mountain. And that is where the final battle will be fought, is at Jerusalem around the Temple Mount. And then ultimately and we don't know how this is all going to play out. I've got my own beliefs, things that I think are probably true about Bible prophecy. Excuse me. But I think we need to remember when we start arguing pre-mid, post-mid, pre-wrath, whatever, and smiting fellow believers because they disagree with our interpretation of prophecy, that the apostles didn't understand the prophecies of the Messiah's first coming.
Right.
In fact, when Paul writes this in 1 Corinthians 2, verses 6 through 8, he writes that the rulers of the age did not understand the mystery that God was revealing. And by rulers, he uses the word archons, which in this context means the supernatural entities aligned against humanity, didn't understand the mystery that God was revealing, or they would not have crucified the Lord of glory.
Right.
They didn't understand that Jesus' mission was to go to the cross, or they wouldn't have been so eager to get him up there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Playing into his hands.
Exactly. But the apostles didn't understand that either.
Yeah.
I mean, in Acts chapter 1, they're talking to the risen Christ 40 days after he came back from the dead. And they're asking him in Acts chapter 1, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel now? They were still looking for a geopolitical savior. They didn't understand it until Pentecost. Okay, tongues of fire come down on the apostles. Boom, start speaking in tongues like, Okay, now we get it. Redemption from sin. That was what this is all about. We shouldn't expect, and I believe that this was deliberate, and that's why Paul wrote what he did to the church at Corinth. The rulers of the age didn't understand the mystery. God is described in the Old Testament over and over again as Lord of hosts. Okay, that means Yahweh of armies.
Right.
Hosts means armies. He is a military commander. And being competent, perfectly competent, he's not going to divulge enough of his plan so that the enemy can devise an effective counterattack. So we shouldn't expect to understand the prophecies of Jesus' second coming any better than the apostles who had the benefit of learning directly from Jesus himself.
Right.
So let's give each other a little grace here if we disagree on some of the specifics, because we're not going to get it right until after the fact. But I do believe that the final battle will be fought for the Har Moed, the Mount of Assembly, Mount Zion. And then ultimately, this puts the first two chapters of the book of Hebrews into a whole new context. In fact, I closed my presentation on this last July by reading from chapters 1 and 2 of the book of Hebrews. And it was so emotional by the time I got to the end. I was weeping. I couldn't speak, really. Because when you understand that all of history has been God's plan to bring us back to his holy mountain and restore us to the divine assembly, the first two chapters of Hebrews take on a whole new context. And again, credit to Mike Heiser for pointing this out. The first two chapters of Hebrews talks about how much superior Jesus is to angels. Okay? And when you get into chapter 2, the author of Hebrews has made that case. You get down to verse 10. And okay, we understand now Jesus is superior to angels, and God is making the world to come subject to us, his creation, not to angels, but to us, humanity. And in verse 10 of Hebrews 2, we read, "For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering." Okay? God made Jesus perfect through suffering. "For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified," that would be us, "all have one source," that being God or Jesus. And this is the key verse here. This is the takeaway. "That is why he, Jesus, is not ashamed to call them," us, "brothers, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers in the midst of the congregation, divine assembly. I will sing your praise."
Wow.
There's a day coming when he restores humanity to the divine assembly. Jesus, "I will tell of your name to my brothers in the midst of the congregation. I will sing your praise." I mean, can you even imagine that? That is humanity's destiny, and the fallen, the rebel angels, who Paul says, "Do you not know we are to judge the angels?" are just enraged that these glorified monkeys, these jumped up simians, that God is placing above them in the cosmic hierarchy. That's got to drive them wild with rage. That's why they have spent so much time and effort trying to destroy humanity, to destroy the bloodline of the Messiah before he could arrive on the scene. Why they are now working a massive psyop, and why there is so much anger, hatred, violence that is centered around this small little spot in the middle of Jerusalem called the Temple Mount. Because that's ultimately where this game is going to end.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable. I mean, it's if more people would have these discussions, both believers and non-believers, I feel that it would be, something that would bridge gaps that have been created by the very psychological operation of the fallen ones. It seems like, as I mentioned earlier, it all ties together in this one narrative. And what I find also interesting is that, this whole context of what you just read out of Hebrews and this restoration, it's interesting that the understanding of salvation and the hope, the blessed hope, is found in this idea of restoration, because there's an obvious seeking for something, and that idea plays into all the occult promises of the fallen watchers given to man, which is this, oh, you're going to ascend, you're going to become gods, you're going to, upload and live forever on a machine, whatever it is, it's all the same sort of promise of immortality, of ascending, of becoming extra human, superhuman, becoming gods. And it plays on that, I think, scar, if I can say that, on the human spiritual, whatever, the human soul that is sin, that Jesus is trying to restore, or did restore on the cross in terms of the spiritual realm. And I think ultimately will come to pass physically as a new heaven and a new earth are created. But it's just so weird because it seems like that the enemy is also playing on that promise and deceiving people into buying into the fallen methods to steer away from that destination, because obviously they hate humanity. And it's interesting that humans are one of the, we are very good at killing each other. And at that level, it just seems like we all know something's wrong with that. And it just goes to show that the biblical worldview of sin and the fallen nature of man is so true. And that these restoration, these ideas of the true hope or the blessed hope of Christ is so powerful that I think anybody who may not even be a believer, but goes through some of this material can understand, like, oh, okay, there is an actual message of hope here. And, in all the preconceived notions that you might have had about the Old Testament God being different from the New Testament God, and all these things that we've been fed have no ground to stand on when you do this deep scholarly dig into the consensus of not just the Bible and what it's saying, but all ancient Near East text and mythologies and things that we have discovered. It's just remarkable to me that we live in this time. And I do think that as we learn more, more will be, I think, demanded of us in some ways to be responsible. And I think that's what Mike Heiser's been talking about with, being kind of direction givers in Middle Earth and his analogy. And I think that's so true, because it's opening up. This world of craziness is opening up to a lot of people, but not a lot of them know how to manage the landscape. They kind of need some guides, because it is a rocky place. I remember when I first started looking into some of this stuff, not necessarily from Dr. Heiser, but I'm talking about the fringe subjects that tie into the Bible. And that's where my questions were. Man, I didn't know what I was listening to. I was listening to New Age guys. Oh, he talked about Jesus. That's good, right? Well, I didn't know any better, So I think the discussions are so important, and having that foundation is so important. And you've been a big part of that, Derek, and finding PID radio early on, because you were the first guy where I listened to, or one of the first I listened to, and said, sounds like a normal guy. And that's nothing against some of the others, but some of the others seemed, there's a little showmanship, a little end of the world tomorrow sense that I got that I wasn't comfortable with, even though I dwelt in it. It wasn't healthy for me. But you were the first guy, you and Sharon, was like, oh, it's a couple. It's, it's a much more
not threatening,
less threatening approach.
They'll bake me cookies, I bet, if they're nice.
Yeah.
Well, I got to agree. I mean, it seems like, kind of going back to my last question and the answer that you gave, it seems like it almost, I don't know, it excites me to hear all these connections, and that, things aren't just happening on accident, such as, Greek mythology. It's not just a random thing that, somebody made up back in the day. It's actually the result of a real life, reality happening all around us. And it's almost a timeless battle going on, it does have a clear beginning and it does have a clear end. And we're just sort of in the midst of it right now. And knowing how it ends certainly does give me a little bit of relief, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting when you look at the way the material is presented to us now. Like I said, most of us who took mythology in high school, I came away at the time with the idea that this is sort of like, Aesop's fables, just fiction, right, that were, kind of stories to kind of guide the ancient Greeks. But, the Greeks and Romans, but this was their religion. They believed this stuff every bit as much as their Jewish counterparts in the same time believed in Yahweh, and they took it seriously. They made sacrifices. They organized their lives based on what they believed these gods wanted of them. But today, well, it's like the phrase we keep bringing back that we open every PID radio with from The Usual Suspects, which actually from a 19th century short story by Baudelaire. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled is convincing the world he doesn't exist. And us in the West, we have fallen for that hook, line, and sinker. Yeah. These Greek gods, these Roman gods, these ancient cosmology, Baal, Astarte, and Molech and Chemosh, just blocks of wood and stone. They're like about as real as SpongeBob SquarePants. No, God called them gods. So unless you're going to take issue with Yahweh, the creator of the universe, and argue that he was mistaken, then you need to realign your thinking. I started down this path and then we got sidetracked, but one of the things I think is just remarkable is the confrontation between Elijah and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. The city god of Tyre, the chief god of the city of Tyre at the time of King Ahab. Ahab married Jezebel, whose father was the king of Tyre. From the time of David and Solomon down, the chief god of Tyre was actually a god named Melkart. And they called him Baal because Baal is just the Canaanite word for Lord, Semitic word for Lord. It's like we say Lord instead of Yahweh, okay? Melkart was a god worshipped by the Phoenicians, who, by the way, were descendants of the Amorites, getting back to the iniquity, the sin of the Amorites, was worshipped by the Amorites, or the Phoenicians rather, from about 1000 BC until about 400 BC or so. And the worship, actually even later than that, because Hannibal, the Carthaginian general, who gave Rome all that it could handle for like 15 years, 20 years, was a devout worshiper of Melkart. And they found temples to Melkart as far away as the coast of Spain, the Atlantic coast. So Melkart was a big deal in the ancient Near East for about 1,000 years almost. But the funny thing is, when you realize, this life or death showdown on Mount Carmel, this holy mountain that had been holy to Yahweh, except they tore down his altar to put up an altar to Baal, who was probably Melkart. Again, Baal, the god of storms, the god who brings the life-giving rain to the crops and the animals and so forth. 3 years before that showdown, no rain in Israel. No rain. Why? Yahweh saying, you have no power on my land. And then, before they, of course, the prophets of Baal couldn't get anything, no response. First Kings tells us no one listened, no one paid attention. Specifically, I mean, it's kind of sad. These 400 guys dancing around like modern-day Shia Muslims on their Ashura festival when they cut themselves with razor blades and knives and bleed all over the place.
Right.
That's what those prophets of Baal were doing, these prophets of Melkart. Then Elijah has 4 pitchers of water filled, again, in the middle of a drought, okay? Go down to the river, fill up this water, and dump it off on the, and do it 3 times. 12 pitchers of water, 1 for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. And then lightning from heaven comes down and consumes the sacrifice. Well, that was supposed to be the chief weapon of Baal, right? Okay, again, not a coincidence. So it may have been the storm god Hadad that was the prophets of Baal here. But again, the chief god of the city of Tyre being Melkart, I think, and there are scholars who agree, that the god worshipped by these priests or prophets of Baal was the god Melkart. What we never hear in church is that Melkart was just the Phoenician name of Heracles.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
The Greek historian Herodotus saw the tomb of Melkart. He was one of these dying and rising gods because he was not a god eternal. He was a mortal who was elevated. One of the Nephilim, because he was a demigod. He was the son of Zeus plus a mortal. One of the Nephilim, which adds a layer of understanding to Elijah's, comment that, perhaps he's sleeping and must be awakened.
Right.
Maybe it's the time of year when he's not supposed to be awake. Like the dying and rising gods, they die in the fall when the vegetation turns brown, and when the spring comes and things green up, that's when the god wakes up.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, and now today you look at, these priests took their job so serious. They were slashing themselves, bleeding all over the place, trying to wake the god up so that he could demonstrate his superiority. And today he's a Disney cartoon. This is how seriously we take this in the West anymore.
Yeah, that's amazing.
But God took it seriously enough that he had Elijah go up there, put his life on the line and say, trust me, I got this.
Yeah.
So Yahweh, God apparently thought that this Melkart, or some spirit that represented himself as Melkart to the Phoenicians, to the Tyrians, was real. So why don't we tell our kids this?
Right. And it just makes me wonder, because by Yahweh's intervention with all this, and he really does taunt these other gods.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to me, because does it indicate that these other gods were fulfilling some of their whatever supernatural giftings to the people who worshipped him, or was it maybe a one-time thing, and then they, a whole ritual was built around it? I'm just trying to get a grasp of like.
Well, that's really interesting, and that's something that probably will require another book at some point to dig deeper into this. Clearly, these entities gave their followers some power, because we saw that in the confrontation between Moses and Aaron and the magicians in the court of the Egyptian king.
Right.
I mean, they were doing something to transform their staffs into snakes and other, tricks. So there's something spiritual, supernatural going on there. We also have a very interesting picture of something in Habakkuk 3. And bring this up here so I don't miss.
Really going into some books that you never even hear about.
Yeah, this is not one that often gets mentioned, but this is really fascinating, because Habakkuk 3 describes the point at which God is said to the Israelites, okay, you've got to, we've done our 40 years time, the old generation that rebelled in the desert and wouldn't go in to take the land when I told them to is gone. So Now we're going to go take the Holy Land, okay? Habakkuk 3, beginning at verse 3, reads, God came from Teman. Teman is a site associated with Edom, okay, which indicates that Mount Sinai was not in the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. It was actually north of the north end of the Red Sea. It was in Edom, okay? And the Holy One, God, from Mount Paran. Mount Paran is another name for Mount Sinai. His splendor covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His brightness was like the light. Rays flashed from his hand. This is a little clue here. Rays from his hand, sort of like the thunderbolt of the storm god. Mm-hmm. Yahweh's the one who wields it, not Hadad.
Interesting.
Or Zeus or whatever. And there he veiled his power. Before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels. Now, this is fascinating. Pestilence and plague, translated in the English, are actually the names of Semitic deities.
Oh.
Deber, D-E-B-E-R, and plague, Resheph. Now, I mentioned that name Resheph earlier in this conversation. You can refer back to it if you like. Resheph was one of the gods, one of the more popular Semitic gods. He was worshipped at the city of what was the one that starts with an E? Oh, gosh. See, yeah. I'm not an expert, but I've been reading a lot of scholarly papers over the last year, and I'm not remembering the name of the city here. But Resheph was worshipped as far back as the mid-3rd millennium BC, like 2500 BC, and was worshipped by the kings of Egypt, the Semitic kings of Egypt, and then the Egyptian kings who followed them, down to the time of Ramses the Great. The god of Resheph was the god of war and the god of pestilence. Was depicted as an archer, remembered at Ugarit as like the gatekeeper to the netherworld. Mm-hmm. Okay, so here we see these deities, and Debir and Resheph are mentioned other places in the Old Testament as well, but you wouldn't know it from reading most English translations. So apparently these entities, whether they're demonic spirits or fallen angels, I don't know, are still subject to the will of Yahweh. Because when Yahweh said, okay, we're marching out from Mount Sinai, we're going forth to take the Holy Land, and Deber, Resheph, you're coming with me, and you're going to do what I tell you to do. Now, here's the kicker. I love kickers. It's like an old habit from news. It's like the final story in the newscast that keeps people waiting so they can see what the joke story is. Like, Resheph was specifically identified in the island of Cyprus as the Greek god Apollo.
Wow.
Apollo, mentioned in the book of Revelation as Apollyon, the king of the pit.
Right.
The gatekeeper of the underworld, also the Babylonian god Nergal. Same god. the God of the underworld, but in Habakkuk 3 and elsewhere in the Old Testament, shown as being subservient to Yahweh. Huh. Now, how does that all work? I mean, is Resheph / Apollyon actually a bad guy? I mean, I always thought so. You read Revelation 9:11. Well, a king over the pit. These demonic things come out. I mean, he must be, king over these things. He must be a bad dude. But then why is he doing what God tells him to do in Habakkuk 3 and, again, a few other verses in the Old Testament? I don't know.
Wow. But
it sure says that there's more going on here in the Old Testament than we've been told.
Yeah.
And the New Testament, too. I mean, there's a lot more going on in the Bible there. Isaiah, there's a passage in Isaiah that where God is condemning the people of Israel for setting places at their table for fortune and destiny. Like, wait a minute here. Now, fortune and destiny, they're the translators of the ESV and most other English translations capitalize the words. Why? Because they're the names of Semitic deities, gods.
Wow.
In fact, the one named Fortune is actually Gad, which is the name of one of the tribes of Israel. One of the sons of Jacob was named, good fortune is, okay, we'll name him Gad.
Wow.
But Gad was the name of a god in the Semitic pantheon.
Yeah, that's, you mentioned earlier in the conversation that the English language has really done a disservice in terms of some of the understanding of some of this stuff. And this is a pretty good example of how much there is underneath the surface of the English words. And so we have the tools now to dig in. So,
well, we have Derek Gilbert now to dig in for us.
What you want to real scholars like Mike Heiser and people like that.
Now here's a question, if I may. We talk about these deities, or I suppose we call them, I don't know exactly what to call them, lesser gods, little gods, that have been sort of playing different roles in history. When you follow them through the different civilizations and the different arrangements there. Now, theoretically, these deities are still alive and operating. That's my first thing for you to touch on. My second thing is, you talk about this Apollo thing, and maybe we didn't quite understand his role as well as we thought we did. Now, this might be getting a little out there, but have you seen in your research any instance where like a deity changes sides or changes their role throughout history, or changes an alliance with Yahweh or something like that?
Well, that's a really good question. And it's hard to say. This is something that Sharon is exploring and speculating on in the series of novels that she is writing. In fact, we're getting set to publish. In fact, we're launching our own publishing company.
Hey, there you go.
Not talked about that previously, but this is something you'll see from Sharon here very soon, a series of novels called the Red Wing Saga. And she speculates that some of these gods may have changed sides. Maybe some of them are wanting to repent. We actually see that in the book of Enoch, where the Watchers call Enoch and say, hey, Yahweh's not listening to our prayers anymore.
Right.
Deliver a message for us. And he
not
does. He comes back and say, he ain't buying it.
Right.
So, maybe there are some. I would also suggest that we have this very black and white understanding of the relationship between good and evil. That, you got God on one side and then Satan and his minions on the other. And that's
right.
it. Well, okay, if these entities were so brazen, so bold, had so much brass that they would rebel against the creator of the universe, the one who exists outside of space and time, why wouldn't they be in competition with one another? All right. Why wouldn't the Prince of Greece, supernatural entity, try to take down the Prince of Persia?
Right.
Or the Prince of Rome, or the Prince of whoever, why wouldn't there be competition between them to see who would reign supreme and establish their personal mount of assembly as supreme in the cosmos? It's probably far more convoluted and nuanced than we understand. My guess is that because we are not physically equipped to really understand what's going on in that realm, because we only perceive 3 spatial dimensions and 1 chronological dimension.
Right.
That, there are probably 6 or 7 other dimensions out there that we can't perceive with our natural senses. God just said, look, don't worry about it. Here's all you need to know. And just don't try to communicate with that realm. If I've got a message for you, I will deliver it to you through the prophets or through dreams and visions. But test those, and when you do hear from spirits, test them against the scriptures.
Right.
Because we don't know. And these entities are clearly not above lying to us. So that's a really difficult question to answer. Like I said, we see in this picture here in Habakkuk, and there are other places in the Old Testament where we have examples of this, where demonic entities or perhaps fallen angels who are, have been given these names representing plague, pestilence, burning, or hail. There's another one that's represented as hail. Maybe they are only do God's will. Maybe they freelance from time to time and go off and just, create evil on their own. We don't honestly know.
Well, there's also, and Dr. Heiser's the one that really pointed this out in his book Unseen Realm and looking at the divine council. But the 1 Kings 22 encounter where, the Lord puts a deceiving spirit in the mouths of the prophets, right? And decrees a disaster. And, there was a spirit that volunteered in the heavenly council to do that. Right. And, you think, wait a minute, God's sending one of his spirits to lie? And it's like, really? But then, you understand the context of the story, and it's because
God had decreed that Ahab was going to fall in a battle.
Right.
But the interesting thing about this, and again, the people who reject the idea of the council because, God doesn't need a council.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Given he doesn't need you or me either, but here we are having this conversation.
Right.
That God asks for opinions. How are we going to do this? And some spirits said one thing and another spirit said another. And finally one said, hey, I'll do it. I'll deceive Ahab by being a lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets. And Yahweh said, go and do so and you will succeed.
Right.
So he knew what was going to happen. I mean, Yahweh knew, but he, for his own pleasure, decided to have these entities with their own free will. And, he serve as sort of I like the way Mike puts it, a supernatural task force.
Right.
To carry out his will. Again, the spirit realm, the supernatural realm is far more complex and nuanced than we've ever been taught. And we don't know the specifics of how it works. And apparently God, for our own good, has not wanted us to get too involved in that.
Yeah.
But we do know enough from the Bible to have a narrative there saying, look, this is where you people started. Here's where you're going to end up if you just trust in me, trust in, the second power in heaven, Jesus Christ, the Messiah as Lord and Savior. And in between, we see all of this activity and the ways that the enemy is trying to deceive us, demoralize us, distract us, divide us.
Yeah, it's such a different perspective from what you're just going to get on Sundays. And I don't think it's a bad thing I think people still need to get some of that stuff in terms of the basics. But I think when you merge some of this stuff, there's a synthesis, if I can use that word, that kind of happens between the head and the heart that I think is missing from the church. But
absolutely.
And back to that point about what it all looks like, what's kind of if there's a God that switched sides or whatnot, it's possible that humans really did conjure up a lot of, or prescribe the gods and worship them, but it was the gods, you look at Psalm 82 and God is sort of mad at the gods for accepting the worship and not doing what they're supposed to do, which is kind of take care of the people. So I find it interesting because, like you said, there's free will, but then, the God of, let's say, the ocean, or the God, the God of thunder, these sorts of elements, it almost seems like maybe they are tasks that get fulfilled by whatever spirit God sends, or whatever entity he sends, to fulfill that role. And the mistake here is either that spirit accepting that role that we give or we assign to them and saying, oh yes, I am God. And then that's part of the rebellion. Or in some cases, maybe it's not so defined as like, oh, the Lord of the air. Well, yeah, maybe there's a Baal that is, kind of trying to take that name, but ultimately the reason why Yahweh seems to be reproving himself over and over again in the Old Testament, right? That he is the true God. Maybe there is a deeper point in that seems to say, like, hey, I'm really in control of all of it. And it is a little bit more nuanced than the us versus them kind of mentality, where God is on one side, Satan and his bad minions on the other, and they're at this conflicting war. That's sort of a simplified explanation for something that's probably much more nuanced. And it feels like as we start understanding this stuff deeper, we're getting into some of the nuances, and we can work out some of these things, and some of the things we'll never know. But at least with what's been given to us in the Word of God, we can investigate. And it looks like on the shoulders of guys like Heiser, you've put together a book that's going to hopefully help people grasp some of this stuff even more. And like I said earlier, going through some of your drafts here, not that Heiser isn't clear. He's very clear. But maybe, and then I said, maybe it's because I'm familiar with the Derek Gilbert kind of tone or like rhythm of speaking. It just sounds like a conversation.
Well, that's how I tried to write it. When I started writing it, I've done some nonfiction writing, contributed to several anthologies published by Defender Publishing, but I've always tried in the past to sound smarter than I really am. And, I'm not Mike Heiser, so I shouldn't try to write like a scholar. And when I got into this project, and I had somebody comment that said, the first chapter or two was still a little bit, and this is coming from a retired English teacher who knows what she's looking at, that by about the third chapter, you kind of hit a rhythm, and it was more conversationalist. Well, that's what I was going for. I tried to write it, imagining myself standing in front of a group as though I were speaking it.
Right.
Trying to make it clear rather than trying to write it in a formal style, because I was really having to force myself into that box, and it didn't really fit. So,
sure.
So I appreciate that, because that's what I was trying to do, was to write it more like I was explaining it verbally to somebody, which is really more my strong suit.
Right.
Sharon's she's got the minor in English. She's the one who can really write. I just try to transcribe what's in my head.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's how this information is going to get out there more. And just, people who are interested can really absorb it. And I think it does shape understanding where we are now, as we kind of touched on during the conversation. And it almost seems like there's a reason why our generation seems to be the ones that starts understanding this stuff, given the context of where we are in human history, that there's a cyclical nature to some of this knowledge. And, I'm excited for your book and the continued work over at Skywatch. I'm sure covering all the stories daily is pretty exhausting with the amount of stuff going on in the world. But, what other plans do you have? Any follow-ups in terms of books to this that you're thinking about working on?
Well, a couple of things. We're working on one for the end of the year that I can't really talk about now, but just for my own.
There, Tom Horn's got you on that leash again.
Secret book.
Just kidding.
Yep. But there's I'm fascinated with the idea that the Amorites may have been more influential in all of human history than we've ever thought. And it's not just because they apparently believed that they were calling on the spirits of the Nephilim and the Watchers to, empower their kings. When you go back and look at their very earliest leaders and the names that are attested by the cultures around them, the Akkadians and the Sumerians, the theophoric names. Again, the names always had the name of a god in them.
Right.
They appeared to have two main deities early on. And once they moved in and took over, Sumer and turned it into Babylonia, they adopted a lot of the gods of the Mesopotamians. But early on, they had two main gods. One was the god, El, who remained the chief god all the way down to through the Canaanite period, the Phoenician period. He was sort of like, semi-retired. And El sort of became a generic name for resident of the spirit realm, like Elohim, okay? Even in Hebrew. The other god that they seemed to worship from the very earliest days was the moon god. And just recently, after writing the book, I learned that the moon god was far more important in Mesopotamia than I ever thought. I've heard Bible teachers teach for years that, Baal and Nimrod are the same, and they were a sun god. And the sun god is, that came down and, Zeus and blah, 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 and Nimrod and December 25th and sun god. Well, no, I'm sorry. The sun god was subordinate to the moon god, apparently. The moon god, in fact, in at least one ancient inscription is described as summoning the divine council. Okay. Including the chief god of Babylon, Marduk. The moon god was the preeminent god. And I need to do more research on this. But here's the reason why I think this is fascinating. The moon god in Amorite, to the Sumerians, he was known as Nana. In Akkadian, it was Sin. But the Amorite name for this god was Yarik. And there was a tribe of Amorites called the Yariku. Now, because Semitic languages, you transpose the Y and the J, you get the name of the city that was a center for moon god worship. That was the first city attacked when Joshua led the Israelites across the Jordan River, Jericho.
Oh.
Now, when you look at the timing of the attack, they celebrated the Passover before they began the attack on Jericho. And the Bible tells us in the book of Joshua, it was on the 14th of Nisan, and they began the marching around Jericho the very next day. All right. Well, Nisan at that time was the first month of the year. Beginning the 1st of Nisan, all across Mesopotamia, they had their big New Year's festival called the Akitu Festival. It was a big 12-day occult working, basically, devoted to glorify Marduk. It involved Marduk coming down from heaven with his consort Sarpanet and having ritual lovemaking at the temple at Babylon to bless the kingdom and all this. Because the first day of the year of the new month in the lunar calendar takes place on the new moon, okay, when the moon is hidden in the sky. The 15th of the month is when the moon is full. So they celebrate the Passover and they go out and they start the attack against the city of the moon god on the first full moon of the new year. Coincidental? I don't know.
Probably not.
Yeah. And then after a little misstep there at the city of Ai, where one of their guys took some stuff that was supposed to be destroyed from Jericho, the city of Gibeon makes a treaty by fooling Joshua into thinking they were coming from a long ways away. The Amorite kings of Jerusalem and most of the major towns in southern Israel, southern Canaan, come together and fight against the Israelites at the Valley of Ajalon. And that was the battle that featured Joshua's long day, where they're defeating the Amorites, and Joshua says, okay, Lord, we don't have enough time before sundown to smite all of these enemies and wipe them out, so please, can you just extend the time period here? All right. The moon god kept out of the sky for a full day while they were busy wiping out the armies of people who apparently venerated the moon god. In fact, and I didn't learn this until last week, the kings of Babylon, the Amorite kings who founded Babylon, even though Marduk was the chief god of the city of Babylon, they actually considered the moon god, Sin, more important than Marduk. They were moon god worshippers.
So the moon god worshippers, God prevented the very moon that they were worshiping from coming out.
Yeah.
Wow.
Now get this. The city that Abram came from, even if we suggest that he came from, southeast Iraq, which I don't believe is true, but they settled in the city of Haran before he came to Canaan, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were besides Jericho, two other main cities in Mesopotamia that were centers of moon god worship. One was the city of Ur in Sumer, which is where we thought previously that Abram came from. The other is Haran. So God went to this Amorite city that was devoted to the moon god and said, I'm going to call somebody from that city to come out and come to Canaan, where in 430 years, his descendants are going to come back and wipe out all the other moon god worshipers from the land that I'm claiming for my people. So what is the symbol of the fastest growing religion on planet Earth today that within 50 years is supposed to surpass Christianity?
Islam.
Wow. So is there a connection there? I don't know. Physically, maybe not, but spiritually, it's outside the realm of possibility. In fact, Joel Richardson's new book, Mystery Babylon, he makes a strong case that Mecca and Saudi Arabia are Mystery Babylon for that very reason.
Yeah, I saw the premise of the book there, and I've covered this little point of info here in past episodes, but it's worth mentioning given the context here. Ephesians 6:12, very familiar passage. The Greek word cosmocrator, which is usually translated a ruler of this world, according to the Strong's Concordance definition, is a ruler of this world, that is, of the world as asserting its independence of God, used of the angelic or demonic powers controlling the sublunary world. Sublunary world. So the cosmocrators have some sort of connection there to the moon. And then, interestingly, it just reminded me of the writings of Helena Blavatsky, the late 18th or 19th century occultist author who wrote The Secret Doctrine, Volume 1 and 2, which was influential in some of the occult belief systems of some of the darker Nazi types. She believed, or she wrote in her book, that Yahweh, and of course everything's flipped, right, from their perspective, Yahweh is actually just a moon god. and that, you know, that's what the Jews were worshiping the whole time, is the moon god. Very interesting that they would, that she, of all people, you know, the one of the biggest occultists of the 20th century, really, that influenced a lot of the secret societies and stuff in the 20th century, would say that. You know? Just a couple things that you reminded me of.
Yeah, it's certainly, like Gon said, it's hard to fully articulate exactly how this changes the view or the feeling or the paradigm, you know, of the entire spiritual realm, but it certainly does just that. And so I want to thank you for bringing that out and laying it down for us here on the show. Now, is your book out or is it coming out?
It's going to be out mid-March. We had promised a ship date of March 7th. We may miss that by a week or so, but it's going to be mid-March. Okay, and where can people find it? Well, wherever fine books are sold, of course. But if they go to skywatchtvstore.com, skywatchtvstore.com, there's a special offer of The Great Inception, along with Mike Heiser's new book, Reversing Herman. And that package deal will also get you a hardcover edition of the Book of Enoch, and a DVD set of several presentations I've given on this material, plus an audio CD, an MP3 CD, rather, an MP3 CD of 7 hours of interviews. Mike Heiser on A View from the Bunker, my podcast. Over the years, him talking everything from ufology to his new book. What a value! And you can get it now at Skywatch Store, skywatchstore.com. Skywatchtvstore.com. skywatchtvstore.com. Yeah. Well, Derek, thank you so much for coming on the show, buddy. Again, just really, really fascinating stuff. And I can't wait to dig deeper next month, February, March. Yeah. Next month. There we go. And so everybody make sure to go do that. I mean, that Skywatch TV deal sounds fantastic. And I'm not even getting paid to say that. You can pass that along, Derek, just in case they do want to pay me for it. Anyways, once again, we just started an affiliates program. Basil is the first one. Yeah. And only I have exclusive rights. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Derek. Brothers, it's my honor.